Welcome to this series of short video tutorials from Yorkshire Photo Walks called The Basics of Photography. Whether you're just starting out or would like to refresh your camera skills, then keep watching. In this first episode, I'm going to be answering one of the most frequently asked questions on my Yorkshire Photo Walks. Which aperture should I be using? If you're compelled to ask the question, which aperture should I be using, then you may be confused about one of two or even both of these things. First of all, what aperture is and what it does, and secondly, and most commonly, you just get a bit bamboozled by all the numbers. In this video, I'm going to explain exactly what aperture is and what it does, and help you to clarify the numbers on a basic level to help you to improve your photography skills. So let's start off by talking about what aperture is and what it does. Your aperture is basically the hole in the middle of your lens that lets the light in. This hole can either be widened or narrowed depending on the amount of light you have available and also your desired effect that you would like for the photograph. Now, this desired effect is usually your depth of field. Depth of field refers to how much of the photograph is in focus. This photograph on screen now is said to have a narrow depth of field because the subject is in sharp focus, but the foreground and background are out of focus. In this second photograph, it's said to have a deep depth of field because everything from the foreground right through to the background is in sharp focus. At this point, it's important to remember that aperture isn't the only thing that affects depth of field. Your distance between the camera and the subject also has a bearing. The closer you are to your subject, the narrower or shallower your depth of field is going to be, no matter which aperture setting your camera is set on. There are a few more other factors, but I'm not going to go into too much detail on those, seeing as this is the basics of photography. For now, those are the most important things that you need to keep in mind when it comes to aperture and depth of field. So that explains what aperture is and what it does. Now let's move on to the numbers. Most people see aperture settings as one of the most daunting aspects of manual photography. And I suppose I can understand why, because instead of dealing with whole numbers like we do in ISO and shutter speed, we're dealing with decimal numbers, which already throws a cat amongst the pigeons. Now, what we need to understand is, first of all, how the aperture settings relate to the size of the aperture and our depth of field. So the basic way to remember it is the lower the number, the wider your aperture, and therefore the shallower your depth of field. Most modern lenses range from something like f2.8 to around f22. So f2.8 is when the lens aperture is at its widest, and f22 is when it's at its narrowest. Now, in photography, light is measured in something called stops. And a lot of people, because of the term f-stop, think that this just refers to aperture. But it doesn't. It refers to ISO and shutter speed as well. This helps us when it comes to manually putting our settings together. I'll cover all of this in another video, so keep an eye out for it. Now we're starting to get to grips with how the aperture settings relate to the size of the aperture and our depth of field. So we're getting closer to answering that question, which aperture should I be using? So now I'm going to go through a few common types of photography and also the common apertures that are used when practicing those different types. So as Yorkshire Photo Walks tends to be based out in the landscape, I'm going to start off with landscape photography. Magic aperture settings for landscape photography tend to be between f5.6 and f11. This obviously depends on how much of the photograph you would like to be in focus and also the amount of light available. A lot of people like to use a tripod when it comes to landscape photography, so with that stability we can afford to stop it down, which is a common term in photography when it refers to aperture, to f11. But if you're hand holding and you're not too bothered about getting everything in focus, then f5.6 does a great job as well. f8 is a happy medium. Portrait photography is another common type of photography that we tend to be interested in. If you're photographing family and friends or even pets, then f4 or f5.6 are great apertures to use. These allow you to use faster shutter speeds to capture any movement that might be in the scene, but also it adds a nice soft effect to the background and isolates your subject. When it comes to close-up photography, this is when we can open our aperture quite wide because we can really blur out the background and keep our one single focal point in perfect sharp focus. Macro photography, however, people get a bit confused about because they refer to it as like being close-up photography and think I can open my aperture as wide as I possibly can here. But this sometimes has the effect of casting some of the subject out of focus because as we're getting so close, our depth of field becomes extremely narrow. So with macro photography, I would recommend a setting of f4 or f5.6. So let's run through a quick summary of what I've covered in this video. First of all, your aperture is the hole in your lens that lets the light in. The aperture can be opened up or closed down depending on the amount of light available and your desired depth of field. Depth of field refers to how much of the photograph is in focus. A shallow depth of field would be the subject in focus and the foreground and background out of focus, and a deep depth of field would be everything from the front of the photograph to the back absolutely pin sharp and in focus. When it comes to the numbers, try not to get too bamboozled. Just remember that the lower the number, the wider the aperture and therefore the shallower the depth of field. It's also important to remember though that the closer you are to your subject, the shallower your depth of field will be no matter what your aperture setting. When it comes to landscape photography, use apertures between f5.6 and f11. For portraits, use f4 to f5.6, and for close-ups, try using your lens as wide as it will possibly go. Remember for macro photography to stop it down a bit further because it can have the effect of taking some of our subject out of focus because we're getting a lot closer to it. So apertures of f4 and f5.6 are great when it comes to macro photography. So this covers a lot of the main types of photography. I know there are others out there, but it's now down to you to put that theory into practice. There's no better way of doing that than joining me on a Yorkshire Photo Walk. So keep an eye on yorkshirephotowalks.com for our latest schedule of photo walks through inspirational and unique Yorkshire locations. I know there's been a lot to take in here, but please feel free to keep watching this video over and over again and then go out in between, put those settings into practice and you'll be a master of this in no time. I look forward to seeing you on another one of my basics of photography videos very soon, but until then, remember, don't just photograph Yorkshire, experience it with Yorkshire Photo Walks. Thank you for watching.